China has recolonized Africa. In order to stop the abuses and exploitations of Chinese businesses and the Chinese government's acquisition of land and resources from Africa, we believe that Western foreign policy should seek to prevent those Chinese ambitions. Today we're going to be presenting you a case for giving that Western nations should create a foreign policy framework where we put priority on foreign direct investment from Western countries into African nations, and also provide loans to the import-export banks or equivalent thereof in Western nations, where there's a benefit if you get a loan. If you want to have foreign direct investment in an African nation, you get securities and loan, and also export if you encourages African business, because then if they export to you and you import from Africa, then that is you get loans and credits for that as well. So we think that that's the model as part of the main part of our policy framework. Also, we'd support African nations and dispute between them and China, and finally we'd make it a policy issue when we do negotiations with China. So we think that within this policy framework, we can do something like what Obama is doing for making Brazilian oil a priority, and developing infrastructure projects from the West. So let's look at the first point of China's exploitation. What's actually going on? Why is it bad for the people in Africa? First of all, it's a coercive environment. What happens is China goes in to acquire land and resources. They pay massive bribes to the government bureaucracy. So they pay these massive bribes to the government officials and basically screw over contract workers that are working within the country themselves. What does this result in? Well, first of all, it drives businesses away because contracts aren't valid, because if you can bribe the government, if you can bribe the bureaucracy, then, well, the special friend Chinese business gets in instead. So contracts aren't valid, it drives business away. Secondly, we see that it screws over the workers because the current working standards are basically untouchable, because once again we have a foreign corporation coming in from China with different labor standards and that sort of thing. So it screws over contracts, it screws over the workers in those businesses. It's a coercive system because the government, one example is when the government, like for example in Ethiopia, where they nationalize an industry, and then the Chinese government gets a stake in the nationalized industry because they paid enough bribes, because they talk to the right bureaucrats. So basically they're exploiting the natural resources and the infrastructure and the land in these African countries for their own short-term benefit. And we think that that drives away businesses that would allow more stable economic environment, or allow an environment where contracts can flourish and be respected. And that's an environment where businesses are built. But instead, there's coercion. The second issue I want to address is that of labor standards. We see that the health and safety of workers is not taken account of by these Chinese corporations and Chinese government interests that come into these African countries. The health and safety of workers is denied. What's an example of this? Well, first of all, child labor. They basically go in and they don't have any standards on child labor, and so they'll take up children who and instead of developing institutions where they should be in school and developing capital and all that sort of thing, they're basically taking these children out of that, taking them and putting them into a dangerous factory work environment where they work for 12 to 14 hours a day. And yeah, I'll go ahead and take it.
It's naive to believe this is China's fault, right? If you look at Apple computers, they go abroad and use child labor all the time. It's done by every corporation internationally, not just China.
Actually, there are specific labor standards applied on businesses that are based in America for what they can and can't do with labor. Those standards are not put upon Chinese companies. Think about it this way. Even in Chinese factories, people's arms, hands, legs, fingers get chopped off in factory accidents. Think about the kinds of factory jobs that they export overseas to even cheaper labor. We think that those health and safety standards are even lower, if that could be even possibly imagined. So these health and safety for the workers, that's going to be harmed. Obviously, they have no minimum wage. They're harming the laborers, and there's no labor standards. The third thing I want to talk to you about is the environmental standards. Basically, Chinese corporations are notorious within China for being exceptionally environmentally unconscious, right? They're putting out more emissions and spills because there's no environmental requirements on regulations on what they can and can't do. And so in Africa, what happened is, if you look at the example of Nigeria, in Nigeria, because of China's involvement, there are actually more oil spills there than even the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf. There are even more oil spills in Nigeria, and these oil spills happen all the time because there are no regulatory agencies, there are no businesses that self-regulate, and so basically they're exploiting it for short-term gain. And there's no long-term benefit. What do we see? Well, there's the people, there's short-term benefit for the bureaucrats, right? Because the bureaucrats are getting paid off to give the Chinese corporation their, this contract and also, overlook any environmental issues, that sort of thing. They get bribes for that. And we think that there's nothing for the people because the people are getting screwed over from oil spills and emissions and bad air quality and all these sorts of things. In the long run, we're harming the future of these African nations because, let's say that even if they do eventually, start to develop and that sort of thing, and the development process, we think that these sorts of environmental damages are long-lasting. Finally, now that I've examined those 3 points, I want to talk to you about Western investment and why that's good. The first reason is because Western corporations follow the rules. First reason why is because there's a cultural difference on human rights and business practice. So, for example, the Western business practice doesn't operate on giving bribes or those sorts of things to government officials. Western businesses are governed by laws where their headquarters are. So certain labor laws and restrictions are applied, even though they might be looser overseas than they would be in the United States. There are still certain benchmarks that these companies that are based in Western countries have to meet. Next, we see that there's public pressure. Think about the bad wages that corporations get for giving low wages to the factories that they export overseas. Imagine the public responses if they acted like these Chinese businesses where there are no labor standards and there are frequently factory accidents. Imagine the public response and the pressure that would be put on these companies if they acted in the way that the Chinese corporations currently act. Finally, they have environmental standards because they have cultural values and there's international protocols that bind these corporations. So for all these reasons, we can see that we can prefer Western investment and the import-export bank system to encourage foreign direct investment over Chinese hegemony. Thanks.
Thank the Prime Minister for his very eloquent remarks, and I'd like to welcome the Leader of the Opposition to begin the case for the opposition side. Here.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would like to start off this round by saying that the opposition is not in favor of colonialism. But then I would like to follow it up by saying that this emphasis on Western investment, this emphasis on making Africans come and invest in America seems to be, in its sense, a form of colonialism in itself. And we wonder why the opposition, obviously it seems clear that they would prefer Western colonialism, but it's still colonialism, right? It's still putting Africans in a position where they have to come to someone else from a different nation with different values to organize and run a business. We think that is colonialism in itself. We don't know why they would essentially go for colonialism if they hate it. It's no colonialism, and you let the Africans do things on their own, or you use a different means by which you try to disincentivize the Chinese. And that's what my main speech is going to be about. But first, it's a rebuttal. He said the first thing we want is we want more business contracts with Africans themselves. And we think we can do this by investing in them and getting them to invest in us. Maybe. I think your central issue there is more that you want the business contracts to be with us as opposed to with the Chinese. And the way you do this is by paying them more or helping them out to come to us. And you think that they'll be more willing to come to us if they're going to get more money. Well, first of all, I think China will be able to match you on that bid at any point or time ever. In fact, they will raise it to match you because they're richer than our government right now, and they can beat us. And they have more of an interest there, to be honest. They're willing to prioritize it more than us, unless you want to spend a ton of money there, which in case you need to develop that a little bit more. Secondly, they say we want to stop bad labor conditions and environmental harms. Interesting. We agree. We think that's really bad. We don't think that trying to prevent China from buying up land there will actually come about to change these things. Why? Because there's a very complicated method by which you must engage with other nations in order to change their policies. And it's not by hitting them head on and being like, no, you're not going to do this because we're taking the land. That's my main extension point. I'll get into that now. How do we change the policies of other people's countries? We have to use political capital, right? And political capital is limited. it's definitely, you only get a certain amount, and it's dependent upon actions that you take in the present and in the past. Therefore, it's imperative that we prioritize certain things which we will focus our political capital on, those things we wish to change. This stance here is not using political capital well, and because of that reason, we don't think that they will be able to change any labor laws, and we don't think they'll be able to affect any rectification of environmental harms. But why? What could they do here besides this investment thing, which we think, well, they could sanction. We think it's a good thing that they're not doing that, and we're not even going to go into that. The other things that they could do is essentially make this, as they are, they're making it a priority, right, in the U.S. foreign policy. So they want to talk to China about it. They want to make a statement that we don't want China to buy land. This is an interesting claim because it assumes, and it's saying that the U.S. government will always assume that China cannot use land correctly and that China cannot effectively employ people correctly according to human conditions. We think this is a very dangerous assumption, and the fact that the United States government is willing to just say, you can't do this right ever, will actually make them a lot more mad at us and unlikely to cooperate. So essentially, this is a misuse of capital. Why? Well, I already explained one reason, that's the assumption. That'll come in later. Secondly, it brings Chinese government to essentially a brink of being very, very, very annoyed with us. Because essentially, we already disagree on a lot of things, and we make that quite public. We disagree on social issues. We already disagree. We have lots of contention right now in South Seas shipping property rights. There's lots of other things in there going on right now, and China is annoyed at us, and we're annoyed at China. One thing, such as this, added to the top of that pile, is something that makes China more likely to essentially discount us as someone who has anything legitimate or helpful to offer them in terms of advice for their own policies ever. We don't think that this will help them listen to us. And secondly, we think that because of that, we will cause, we would say that the African land, point 3, is an issue that is not to be neglected by us, no, but one to be prioritized, right? We already have this idea that when we come to China with this policy, we're telling them that they can't use land well, and that's bad. We're also telling them that they will probably end up developing a limited amount of respect for us, which reduces our political capital, and we don't like that. Finally, we don't think that we should necessarily impose our own investment or set up our investment in a way that it will be coercively imposed upon Africans. We think that's pretty bad. Secondly, how can we use this capital well, right? Yeah, Josh.
You said that you think it's bad that we tell China that they're using the land bad. At the point where they have massive oil spills and massive labor violations, why do we care how they respond when we tell them they're using it bad?
You should care because you should want to affect change there, right? What we want to do is affect change, and we're trying to find the most effective way to do that. Perhaps telling them may not be an amazing way to get a huge response. We're willing to admit that China doesn't always listen to us. But it's more effective in the long run than coming at them and saying, we think you can't ever use this land well, therefore we're going to try to take it away from you with our own investment, which is essentially what your plan does. They're not going to like that. They'll be less likely to listen to us in the long run. How could we use this political capital better? 3 ways. 1, we can use it to actually try to help or inform the Chinese onto what types of ways they could use the land better. And this is where we get right to your speech. 1, labor conditions. If we don't waste our political capital trying to stop them from getting the land, they might listen to us when we say it's probably better for your image in the rest of the world, it's probably better for your people, it's probably better for your own popularity ratings in your own country if you support better working conditions and better wages in your African businesses. We think they're more likely to listen to us if we come to them with that. And we say, look, we think you can use land well, we just don't think you're doing it now, and we're not objecting to you getting it, we just think you can do a better job of using it. And secondly, environmental harms. Same thing. We think that it's pretty bad for them to be abusing land, but we don't think that just trying to take it away from them is the best way to get them from stopping doing that. Because they're going to keep on abusing land, the stuff that we can't get, which we think is limited, and they're going to acquire more of it and they'll keep abusing it unless we can get them to change their mind. Will it change their mind? Maybe not. But what we're saying is there's more of a likelihood of us changing their minds on the opposition side than there ever will be on the government side. The final way that we can use this better is to actually focus on other issues that we think are more important. 1, human rights. 2, women's rights. 3, social policy in the one-child policy in China. They're already recognizing that this is not exactly a good thing, and if we spend political capital needlessly on other areas such as this African thing, then we can probably reallocate it to these other areas, where they're already almost at a tipping point of saying this is no longer necessary for our society. Finally, tensions in the South Seas, an already existing issue which causes just as much strife as the African, if not more, because our own interests are involved. For all these reasons, because we think this is a waste of political capital and ultimately will not lead to changing China's policies and labor conditions, and environmental problems we strongly oppose.
I'd like to thank the Leader of the Opposition for his eloquent remarks, and I'd like to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case for the government side here.
I want to get into rebuttal and go to talk about my two main points, political influence and African businesses. And then I'm going to do a little bit of weighing of some of the stuff we've heard out of the opposition compared to the government side. So responding to the POI coming out of back half, they talked about child labor and Apple, right? And the Universal Commercial Code in the United States actually says that the place you're headquartered is where the labor standards would apply, with some exceptions for things that aren't really important, but child labor is one of those things that is considered important. They actually buy something from a company that employs child labor, and that company is, probably in a country like China or Malaysia or something like that, where they don't care about those types of issues. Second, they said, we're saying China can't do this. We're not saying that. We're saying China doesn't do this right now. Maybe if China starts, being really good at foreign direct investment and helping the people, we will be on the side of China, doing business. Maybe over and above the United States if they get really good. We're just saying right now this is a good policy. That doesn't mean they can't change. And then he's sort of this big point. China will be pissed. Okay, great. My first response, so what? Really? The South Seas are going to be a little bit mad and not give us our property rights or something, if that's important in some sense? And he's like, well, we're going to waste all our political capital. Yeah, because we have so much political capital. We've been able to get all the Nobel Peace Prize winners out of jail in that country, right? We basically have we don't really have this ability to just get them to do things that we want them to do by being nice. That's sort of ridiculous. And we don't think they're going to declare war or anything crazy like that, because first, it is crazy, and second, we buy a lot of their stuff, so they kind of have an interest in making sure we don't do anything really drastic, right? And this isn't drastic. And then he said, well, we want to affect change. Okay, great. We want to affect change too, and this does affect change because right now the Chinese businesses that are doing things are doing bad things, and if we're able to get Western businesses in there or African business, that would create actual change for the African countries, and that would be good. Also, since when does China care about popularity ratings? Mention that. I mean, what the heck? Okay. So the first point is political influence. We say that economic influence leads to political influence, right? So when you have a large part of a nation's economy, like you're importing a lot of copper from that nation, especially if it is a very poor nation or a war-torn nation, or other unstable nations like the ones in Africa, right? You're able to some extent to dictate national policy. Let's say that China is investing in a country. What are its political interests? Well, let's see. A strong man it can control so that all its contracts are honored and kick out all the competition, and they don't have to, pay fair wages or anything like that. So they would prefer sort of a dictatorship type of regime, and they can largely control that within the economy by saying, well, if you do this thing, we're actually going to maybe pull out of that area, or we're going to do something bad with all the economic influence in the area. Because if you're buying all sorts of things and actually a large number of people are on the payroll, you do have that kind of power, right? And we'd also say that nationalized industries also sell a lot of copper to China and that kind of thing. So even if it is a pseudo-African nation, often they'll bribe, again, people in the government so that they get exclusive contracts or something like that. So they actually have a strong interest in not having unstable nations, and a lot of places in Africa, what causes instability are things like free press, free speech, free religion, free elections. All these types of things are really bad for business, because it might be that they don't want Chinese to own their copper. They might want African copper for Africans, or any number of things like that. It's very bad for business to have unstable things like that. Very good for business if you can control the court system through bribes and that type of thing. And that's actually what we've seen Chinese businesses largely doing. So the second point is African business, and that's the important thing about using the Import-Export Bank, or the equivalent, because this isn't just the United States, right? We think France has a similar institution. And what that basically does is give subsidized loans or loan guarantees to firms, domestic and abroad, that do business with your country, right? To overcome some of regulations or whatever, things like that, expenses and customs and A lot of people do this, right? So we think that this import-export bank will be able to subsidize African businesses as well, especially if it were a foreign policy issue, to get over some of those starting costs, right? To get over some of the costs inherent in having a very low capital in your country and starting it up as an African business without the experience that you have from the West or from China.
Yeah, but you're going to be investing in African businesses, and African businesses use child labor, and African businesses violate environmental standards too, right? It's not just the Chinese putting Chinese workers there. They're the ones that
Right, understood. So
countries
while African labor standards are probably not the best in the world, we'd say, we also think that it's better for them to have this and also have this connection to the United States or France or the UK or some other Western nation or through the UN, to have that type of connection and be able to say, okay, maybe with strings attached, for instance, or any number of other things, or maybe constructing infrastructure to aid those businesses. There are all sorts of ways that accountability structures can be created. For example, by recommending a uniform commercial code or something of that nature, all sorts of things that they'll be able to do with influence and that type of thing. Well, this will help capital flow to Africa and actually help prevent Dutch disease, and that occurs in a lot of African nations when people they're largely just exporting raw materials, right? So they're exporting a lot of raw materials to China, and it's very much in the Chinese interest to make sure that's all they do, because that keeps the labor costs nice and low. Well, what happens when you have that type of economy that's not diversified at all? It's called Dutch disease, because you have to purchase oil, for example, or coffee. Coffee has happened in Nigeria. In the local currency, and when all the money is put, a lot of money is put in the local currency, the value of it relative to other currencies appreciates. And when that happens, it kills your exports, right? So because now when you're exporting to the rest of the world, they have to buy it in your currency, which is actually appreciated and more expensive. So it actually, this incredible non-diversification of just one resource, for example, to China, will lead to harm for the country's exports and keep them in that low state, which China might be interested in doing if they want to keep low costs, and we think they do have a political incentive to do this type of thing. So we'd say this is much like empowering Africans versus a colonial system. And now let's get into the weighing a little bit. So the harms on their side, we'd say, are the horrible incentives to do really bad things, like Chinese having bad labor standards, bad pollution standards, bad political advice to these companies, and having all this control. This is really, really bad. And the benefits on our side would be that the influence from the West, even just the culture of contracts rather than a culture of coercion, would come. And Transparency International, for example, ranked different businesses and different practices in different countries, and Chinese businesses were ranked as some of the most corrupt in the world, whereas the West is largely not as corrupt. And so we feel that this type of weighing would clearly result in more benefits on our side, and few harms likely in political capital on their side.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for his very thoughtful remarks, and I'd like to welcome the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to continue the case for the opposition side.
Thank you all for coming to join us today. I do want to talk just very briefly about what the kind of last topic was there, as far as I understood it, and then I want to get into essentially 3 points. One is going to be possibilities, and I'll frame that, and then 2, what burdens we should claim, and then 3, essentially the actual ability to make those claims. But first off, this idea of the Chinese getting a lot from one crop and essentially depreciating the world market, I'd like to point out that it's not good investment for China to depreciate the world market as a whole. They do want to profit in a sustainable manner and not cause economic turmoil. Furthermore, they don't want to produce only one crop and exhaust the land in some foolish manner. They want to use it responsibly, or at least they should. And if they haven't yet realized that, much like many things that aren't realized around the world, we're willing to share those ideas. And that's going to come up in all way of interacting with the Chinese government, and rather than trying to either coerce or outdo them, we try to cooperate with them in a good way. But I want to get into this first point, and essentially you can frame this as what a nation can do and what a nation can't do, because we believe this is very important. We cannot outbid China. This is a very simple matter. I mean, for one, it's ridiculous to attempt to get into a bidding contest with someone you're borrowing from. Dropping that fact that we are borrowing from them, we do not have the capital to outbid them, simply spoken. So they will essentially win. The difference is, will they win at higher prices, more agitated with us looking for other places to cut costs, or will they win at a reasonable price where they go in and develop the land effectively and efficiently? Before I go on though,
But surely at the margin, this will result in relatively more Western firms and fewer Chinese firms actually in these places. You don't think that they'll just universally raise the price, and that wouldn't even be bad, because there'd just be more money in Africa.
interesting points in the POI. The first, though, again, no, there won't be marginally more Western firms, because wherever we try to directly intervene in any meaningful way, they will outbid us. And this idea of an influx of Chinese money is an interesting one, but we ultimately don't see the marginal difference that Chinese is going to be paying into them worth the political capital we're losing by opposing China. We don't see that this is good, when we would rather take all of our, as Greg called it, political capital or persuasiveness and persuade them to use things properly. But that gets into my next point, which is essentially how we would interact with China. I would say we also we ought not to take up the burden of aggravating China in order to prevent their investment and replace it with our own. Because there's no moral standing there. We're essentially saying, we like investing too, so move over. And they're like, no, you don't have enough money to allow for that, and now we've lost all respect for you. What we would prefer, though, is taking things we do have a moral standing on and advocating such things as human rights and the proper use of resources. For example, maintaining a respectful stance with China and opposing the one-child law, which they're already coming around to that it might not be as good an idea as they thought it was before. So continue to press that. Continue to press for effective change in other regions rather than just totally shutting down conversation with China by imposing them economically, which is where they're strongest and which is what they care about most. But even further, though, and in even a less confrontational manner, like not even telling them stop doing one-child policy, we can actually interact with them in a supportive manner, telling them, China, there is a profitable way to use land and resources. We want to show you what that is, or we want to help you discover what that is, respective to Africa. We want to look to the long term and show you how there is greater benefit to be gained in the long run from responsible use of investment than there is by just stripping land bare or exhausting it and not letting the ground lie fallow and all such things as that. Essentially, our principle is that sustained land is more profitable, and the reasonable businessmen of China can and will respond to that, as long as we don't first demean our standing with them by opposing them in direct opposition.
On that point? No. What reason is there to believe that this is actually profitable for China in the long term for these people that have, for example, democracy? Doesn't it just rise the price of raw materials?
I'm not certain that I actually understand what the speaker is addressing about democracy right now. In the long term, we're talking about people whose rights are respected, who perhaps live in a healthy manner and thus make productive workers, and who use land in a manner that won't deplete it and thus make it a useless piece of land in the end. Whether democracies develop in Africa is largely up to the Africans, which is why we oppose the idea of American investment on a colonial level as well. We're fine with American foreign aid, we're fine with helping people for the sake of helping people, but when you mix it up with these other interactions about going in and investing on our own, then we're just essentially doing what we want to stop China from doing, and it just doesn't make any sense. I haven't taken a point.
Thank you. So why do you think that the Africans would prefer to have us dole out aid to them as opposed to actually investing in long-term sustainable solutions so that they can take care of themselves?
So yes, the aid that I was referring to was emergency aid in the immediate as it's needed, and they would prefer that because they don't want us entrenched in their culture. They don't want an American-dominated society here. But we are going to leave this largely up to them, and what we're saying is that if China is going to do this and already investing in ways that are ultimately going to be more prosperous because they are a more prosperous economic actor, we're fine with letting them do their economic thing while upholding human rights on our part. We'll say, China, you are good at economics, do that. We're good at respecting human rights. Let us help you with that. Let us help you with that. So ultimately, because we think that we have a better chance of advancing human rights in Africa by not opposing China on economics, because we think that we have a more sustainable model for economics that we don't have to directly invest in or colonialize ourselves in Africa, and because ultimately pissing off China is a very bad idea for us in the South Seas and anywhere else, we very strongly oppose.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition for his very thoughtful remarks, and I'd like to welcome the Government Extension to continue the case in the second half.
What we need to stop is the stealing of resources that are coming from Africa. I think that essentially what China is doing is going into Africa and setting up these businesses for China and then taking that money and leaving Africa destroyed and better and worse off than it was before. This is the problem that we see on our side and that we're going to correct. What I'm going to be talking to you about in my speech is that how this is that the countries of Africa at a critical stage in their long-term stability and having good economic for the future and how we preserve that. Additionally, I'm going to talk about the environment and how that hurts that and how it hurts indigenous cultures. But before I get into those points, I'm going to go into some refutation of the arguments that we heard coming out from the other side. So first of all, they have a very degrading view of how Africa is perceived as this country that we should just give aid to because they can't do it on their own. What we think that we should do is invest in Africa because we think there's a lot of potential within the people of Africa to do good work on their own and that they can build their own economies as we have been seeing. And now I'm going to be very clear about what we stand for is that what we are opposing is the acquisition of land and just setting up businesses and that China will take the profits from those businesses and then do whatever they want, don't really care about what's the African people or the land of Africa. Because quite frankly, once China isn't in Africa and they can leave Africa and go back to China and just take the money, they don't have that same incentive. I think that's particularly harmful. What we think is good on our side of the house and what they propose all along our side of the fence is this investment into the businesses of Africa. And by having that investment, you can have these good political relationships with them and hopefully partner with them in the future and to benefit them and Africa, not just stealing their resources and benefiting China. Go ahead, back.
All right, but in order to solve for the harm of China taking the land and resources, the U.S. would have to take the same land and resources that the Chinese don't, which is just as imperialistic.
No, what we're saying is we'll invest in their businesses, and then later on, when their businesses are going well, maybe they'll want to partner with us in a mutually beneficial situation. What this is specifically saying is that China is just benefiting without the African people getting to benefit. I think this is particularly harmful. But now I'm going to get into my main point and how what we're doing, how this is a critical stage for the African countries of Africa, countries like Uganda, Kenya, Cameroon, Ethiopia, that are all on this critical stage of economic development. We think that what's going to happen is that China is going to move in on this critical stage is when there's a lot of work has been done and they're sort of on the merge of being able to have this sustainable development in which that they can move on their own. But China will go in and set up their own businesses and take that capital away from them when they most need it. And what's really good about having your own businesses and having money within your own country is those helps to build a lot of really good forums and a lot of the things within your own country. And things like education systems, things like healthcare, money which can benefit the people of your own country. But things that China, quite frankly, doesn't really have any investment in because, quite frankly, China isn't the countries of Africa, and the people of Africa are the countries within Africa, the continent. Ultimately, what they're able to do is that they're able to take the profit of that money and to use it to do things that are progressive and invest in green technology or do whatever they want to do with their land and the resources that actually belong to them. And we think that all these types of things go along with democratic, a lot of good democratic things because when you have a country of people that are taken care of and have the ability, to build these types of infrastructure on their own, we think that they're able to have better forms and better democratic means of going on. So we think that ultimately a lot of potential within a country relies within the resources of that country. We think that on the idea of the environment and the fact that the resources are what make a lot of Africa, the countries of Africa, have value is that that's what makes the environment critical to them. And by going in and taking those resources from them, you take all the potential of them to actually actualize and to create these businesses and to create these long-term potentials for their own people. And quite frankly, just Africa can't leave Africa. And when China moved in and they built the Three Gorges Dam that destroyed cultural artifacts and lots of other types of things, ecologically, things like that. China doesn't really care because they're not the people that are living there. It's not their continent, it's not their countries. What investment do they have within them to actually create sustainable businesses that have policies, that have work regulations that benefit the land? Because ultimately they don't care because they can just take what they need now to have those economic gains quickly, and then they can leave Africa. But Africa has the potential to create sustainable development because ultimately they're the people that are going to be living there for the long term, and they have the biggest investment. I think that they should be the ones doing it. China shouldn't be going in to prevent that from happening. But now I'm going to go into the idea of how indigenous cultures are going to be really specifically harmed by these policies. First of all, we see this. China really doesn't care too much about indigenous cultures. We see this in Tibet. They go into Tibet and they don't care about their language. They don't care about their culture. They're willing to sacrifice all those important things, those human things that people identify with and that make them happy and provide a lot of good things for people. They don't care because they go in and take those things at the benefit of having financial gains for themselves, and ultimately that's their priority as a country, to benefit themselves. But at the point that's actually hurting people in another country and that they don't have their culture being preserved, that's when we have to step in and stop them from doing those things. And we think that China is likely to do that in this case because the land has a lot of cultural significance, especially to these people. Their resources provide cultural, significance, and when you're actually having to physically destroy the land to build these businesses and to acquire these resources, what you're physically doing is maybe destroying cultural sites, destroying places where people live, degrading the land in a way that totally degrades the people of those countries without their consent, and just taking the money and bringing it back to China. At the end of the day, what's most important is that the sustainability of the people and the livelihoods of the people in Africa and their land and that their cultures are being preserved. They have the best incentive to do that. The only way that can happen is by having investments into their country to form these partnerships, not by acquiring their resources and taking it and leaving it. We proudly propose.